So, Doc, how many times have you eaten at the Outback Steakhouse?
I've been known to tongue a bloomin' onion once or twice.
Crikey. Right in the cloaca. Dear Christ.
It's doing a death roll.
So, there was a bit of pre-roll conversation that happened where some exploits that may or may not be fit for public consumption were shared. And all I can say is to the people of Australia, you were a prison colony, but some of you, it seems like, are still going to be dealing with, punishment of a carnal nature for quite some time going forward, but...
Still love the handcuffs.
Or finger cuffs, depending upon the story you told us, but all the way back. Obviously, for those who are paying attention, all three of you that are left, we were not here last week, and so you have my sincerest apologies. Life sometimes finds a way, as Michael's so fond of saying, and there's a lot of crazy circumstances happening for everybody these days, not included. I, unlike Doc, who can't be, couth enough to not just cough all over the episode, I wanted to save you all from my phlegm and elected to tag out, and unfortunately that didn't carry on. But we're back with you now.
Yeah.
Live and in living color.
Ooh.
I have a question,
good
actually,
show,
something
good
I meant
show.
to ask. Pre-roll, I can't recall, because I mostly just binged the entire back catalog when I was catching up. Have you guys missed weeks before?
Nope.
Nary once. That was the first time in, over 180 episodes.
Wow.
So, yeah. And, I'll just go ahead and say that was largely due to me. I'm just going to... I'm going to play Doc for a second here, and in all my vainglorious nonsense, we'll say, yeah, this is all due to me and my stalwart attempts at keeping us live and in living color. No, that's... Michael was a very dedicated editor, and I'm sure if we had cut several other, 3 to 4 hour epics into multiple parts, I think we might have been able to
Probably
build up a little accumulated time. But some of us were very, very enthusiastic about the prospect of pre-rolling multiple weeks so that, we'd have a buffer in case things like this happened. And then that we just kind of fell out of the habit due to unfortunate circumstances. I'm not going to be slanderous. At least for another 5 minutes. But in any event, not that matters. And speaking of invoking terrible names for other people, by the eternal, behold. It is the Disinformed podcast. I'm Shane.
And I'm Michael.
Usually I like to start with anecdotes or jokes or other things, and I feel like we got so much nonsense on the record before we technically started the episode that I'm kind of at a bit of a loss at the moment. I was going to start having conversations about Alexander and other nonsense. The lead that I had into the show for Michael was, have you seen All Quiet on the Western Front yet?
No. I can't say
I'm
I have.
disappointed.
I know.
Yeah, neither have I.
It is well worth watching, and not purely for the fact that I know I have a couple of people who are titillated by history, and I don't just mean banging archaeologists. But I know I have folks very interested in history. I forget so much about World War I, specifically because it's just not often discussed, and I think the travesty of World War II and the body counts there tends to sort of cast a cloud or a pallor over all previous wars.
Or choice of words for one.
Thank you. Well, I was going for mustard gas.
Yeah.
But it really does drive home how just the atrocities of trench warfare when you get to actually see it enacted. They do some really marvelous... The sound design is brilliant in this thing, and it is one of the most creative scores that I have encountered. And so when you watch the film, I hope that it's as impactful for y'all as it was for me. But just even the hints that they have in the trailer for the film made me want to watch the movie just because it was such an interesting sort of infectious score.
Have you seen the previous incarnations of the film?
I have not, and I never read the book. It was one of those things where, I had enough discussion about it previously, but I felt like visually it was very arresting. It's really well done as far as a shot film. and it was fantastic. And the fact that it's getting so much discussion for the Oscars, I feel like, is really interesting.
Ooh,
so
okay.
I'd heartily recommend it. But I felt like it also played into the prior discussions of, the Russian Revolution and a czar that may or may not have been assassinated. And I feel like looking back at that time frame for all the circumstances at the end of World War I that occurred, really interesting for discussions about the German peoples, I find, because, they wound up fighting that war all by themselves by the time you get to the end there.
They are an
all the
amazing people. I mean, like, just to think they were so, for starters, I mean, like, it is, to your point of not really discussing World War I often, it is kind of a shock in itself, considering the Great War itself only ended just over 100 years ago. So, there are literally people alive today that, were alive, while it was being fought. It is shocking that, it is fallen so far from like the cultural mind. But in terms of the German people, it is something to behold there, because I mean, like they go and they fight World War I, and do an amazing job in terms of like being successful. I mean, yes, they ultimately lost, but they didn't actually like
taking on the world.
Well, and they didn't lose on their own soil. So at the end of it, they could, the German people like didn't have a war fought on their own soil, so they could kind of have that sense of betrayal. Like, we didn't actually lose because they didn't feel it at home.
Yeah.
And they didn't start the war technically, which makes it even more tragic.
The dominoes of the treaties and everything. Yeah,
exactly. Right. So it's like, they didn't start everything, and then they didn't start the fire, to quote
just
Billy
to be
Joel.
crippled and have like, the Weimar Republic, agree to these reparations that would have had they been continuing to being paid, they would have gone into the 1980s. And so, I mean, like, you don't have a military, you don't have an air force, you don't have a navy, you owe all this money, you're completely crippled. People are literally wheelbarrowing marks just to be able to buy like a thing of bread.
It's a loaf of bread, yeah.
And to go from that, in the aftermath of the Great War to 2 decades later, oh, we're ready to take the world on again.
It's a world power, yeah.
And damn near do it, is just like, and then again get crippled. And, after the fact, this time make sure to, bring the war and the effect of the war to the German soil. So they really do realize, hey, this time you lost, right?
Yeah.
And then we break them up. We cut them in half, east, west. We even take their capital city, split that one too. And, then again, like, half the country is crippled, until my lifetime. And then, they finally have reunification. And what happens now? They are the powerhouse of the EU. They're the ones that are like the financial backer behind it. They're the major powerhouse in terms of, money and everything. And it's like, God damn, like, you cannot keep these people down.
Added to which, they are essentially paying reparations forward as a country in perpetuity for the atrocities that occurred during that time frame.
Yeah.
And get to live with that as part of the national consciousness, where that's just dyed in the wool as who you are as a German, is that, oh yeah, the Nazis. It's inexorably linked to who they are as a country, which is fascinating to have to deal with.
But then in other ways, to be able to take it like, and even, kind of take the democratic baton and run further with it than America does. Like, you can be in America and you can fly a swastika on a flag here, and obviously your neighbors will be judge you, and people will know
for
you're a terrible person.
Yeah.
Of course, people will know you're a terrible person, but you can do it. Whereas you go to Germany, you fly the swastika flag, and you're gonna get arrested. And so it's like, damn, like, in many ways they've even taken that baton and run further. And I think that is speaks incredibly highly of just their work ethic, their diligence, as a people.
The resiliency.
Yeah.
The fact that they kind of learned from their oopsies, their accidents from, the World War II and all that stuff. Like, I think that it's really interesting that they still don't allow people to identify in that way. And they teach that very importantly against the Nazi like ideologies, and that's not something that they really do here with like the Confederacy and all that stuff. I mean, I don't want to get too far afield with that, because I feel like
I think that was kind of the point I was going towards.
Exactly.
That,
yeah, I agree.
So one of the first papers that I wrote when I was in college was discussing the transition into the National Socialist regime within Germany, and thinking of the unemployment rate prior to that power taking over. It was something like 80% in the country.
Yeah.
And then suddenly, when you create a war machine, you're able to kick everything up into motion, and they were a world power again within, a 2-year period. It's absolutely fascinating. So the fact that you have this machine that's created, and then all of the subsequent fallout from having a dictator, it's unfortunate. But if you had stopped short of, what Hitler was and the atrocities perpetrated, it would have been a ridiculously inspiring story to talk about how you had this nation that had completely fallen from power, that was impoverished, fighting amongst themselves. And the unfortunate caveat to put into that is that most of the people who had the wealth that was remaining in that were the people who were subsequently killed and had that stolen from them. It's just a fascinating study. But as a character study, to think of what happened to the German people at the end of World War I, going into what precipitated World War II even occurring, and the sort of national social conscience that existed to create the bedrock by which the National Socialist Party came to prominence, is something that I don't think a lot of people consider. It's just, we cast aspersions like, how could this country be so easily duped and so easily led astray into, let's just, throw people into internment camps and slaughter them en masse. Well, they weren't necessarily running around throwing that into the propaganda machine of like, by the way, mass exterminations. But furthermore, they're also, when they're establishing power, they are bringing back, we want Germany to regain the austerity that we once had. We want to regain lands that we lost in this war that was not our fault. So all of these little things that sort of coax people down the rabbit hole, and we can see just even in recent American history how easily you can dupe people into following you down a particular rabbit hole if you are just convincing. And that man was not even a great orator. So if you take someone who has a bit of fire and brimstone that you can throw to get people riled up into a nice teeming mass, it's just fascinating. And then to think about what we talked about previously, what happened in Russia at the time that precipitated their involvement in the war, and then they're getting out of the war, and you've got czars that are falling, and you have got kaisers that are leaving office. It's an interesting bit of turmoil happening on the world stage that I think just gets completely passed over to looking at World War II. So
yeah, and I agree. And like, as much as World War II is a world war, I feel like a lot of the effects that we still see, even especially today, are more of an effect of World War I. I mean, you have the Sykes-Picot Agreement that pretty much divided the Middle East into the political lines that we see today. And that is one of the main reasons why there's a lot of conflict in the Middle East, is because a bunch of stiffy white guys were like, let's just divide everything by these lines that I drew on a map, as opposed to the people that are actually there. And because that was the thing when the Ottoman Empire fell. And
that was, I was thinking about that, not to interrupt you.
No, you're fine.
In reading back, because I wanted to refresh my memory, because it's been so long since I even read anything about World War I, that they were talking about that fighting occurred in the Middle East. And I'm like, how the hell did that even happen? How did that transpire that you have this starting over here completely on, in the east side of Europe, and then all of a sudden we've spilled over there, and you're like, okay, well, yes, we have the Ottoman Empire that got brought in with the Czech Republic as it is now, and Slovakia, etc., getting embroiled in these things. And you're like, you just don't think of the ramifications of how one assassination broils out into all these other things, because everybody was already kind of at a precipitous tipping point to begin with, and then everything just kind of falls in on itself.
Just needed a single domino.
It's fascinating, really interesting. So I know it's something we don't often have the opportunity to chat about, but I wondered why we didn't hit that in the episode when we're talking about Russia. But again, we'd have this conversation.
It's so interesting because it's not just the falling of the dominoes. It has to be that kind of perfect timing of everything too, because this is, in a situation, if something like that was to happen today, everybody is aware of the technological advances that have happened with modern warfare, that even if you had these treaties, you'd have some backing out, people like, kind of hemming and hawing and finding a way to kind of back their way out of it.
Yeah.
Whereas at the time, you have these treaties, but these treaties are largely already having kind of been, started to, form in the 1880s, 1890s with, after Bismarck had left, and these protective treaties coming on, in which, warfare was still like, on horseback and
still
so,
almost gentlemanly of sorts.
Yeah, and so you could have these treaties of like, okay, if you go to war, we'll back you up, and then let these dominoes fall, without the modern mindset of, oh, this is going to mean tanks and trenches and millions of deaths. So these treaties are designed in a way that was fighting last year's war and not the current war. And I find that so interesting, just because you do have that confluence of political affairs that result in the war itself, but also it only continued to escalate and all the dominoes were allowed to fall just because we were right at that stage of like airplanes are just now coming out, tanks are just now getting developed. So it's like all of this stuff is really just happening that nobody really has a clue what war actually looks like.
Yeah, and it's funny, that's one of the aspersions that are cast at the Polish for, attacking tanks with horses, and you're like, they had nothing else. There wasn't another option. So, like, what are you going to do, run at it on foot?
Yeah.
Which, it's no more or less imbecilic. And then I was thinking about, you blame a lot of the movement into modern warfare and quote-unquote guerrilla warfare or guerrilla fighting on the United States, because that we're fighting the Brits and we are not lining up to let them just exterminate us wholesale. It's like, no, we're going to sneak in behind them and we'll lay in wait and ambush people and break the rules of engagement and not have gentlemanly combat, like as far as my recollection goes. So just fun things to think about. Michael, I see your brain is turning.
Well, because like Europe hadn't really had a major war since the Crimean War about 50, 60 years, 70 years before. Most of the major wars that happened outside of Europe. You had like the Boxer rebellions in China. You had the Civil War in the United States. You had, the Boer Wars in the late 1890s, early 1900s. Most of the major conflicts that occurred were outside of Europe. So when people were, rubbing their hands ready to be like, all right, let's use some new technology, they didn't really expect like, oh, it's these big powers that are equally or at least equally matched fighting against each other. Whereas like most like Britain, France, a lot of the colonials, they were just doing colonial warfare, where they were just like, all right, well, these people that don't have as much technology as us, they're fighting in some distant land. We can send some people out. Yeah,
you can roll them over. Yeah,
exactly.
Well, and you're not even learning the lessons from your neighbors as well, though, because Russia, this massive colonial power that was one of Europe's strongest, had only recently gotten their ass kicked by the Japanese.
Yeah.
And yet you don't learn that lesson to pause and reflect. Well, how the hell could Japan take out Russia and win? How could that happen? Oh, maybe it's got to do with modern technology and like, oh shit, if we apply that to a more global scale, this could get bad quick. Maybe we should scale back. Mm-hmm. But it's just such a fascinating time with so much that was just changing all at once. I mean, like, we're exploring like air, travel and you're really taking off there. Movies are just really, becoming a major thing. And even like, finally getting used as like propaganda with
ooh, that's an even good point. Yeah, that's another good point, right? Because you like I don't even know if talkies were a thing like that were mass produced yet, but like no, even so I think it was like the 20s.
But you had the Birth of a Nation, which was like just a pure propaganda
I think
film, and that's like 1914 or something like that.
The Great Train Heist or the Great Train Getaway or something like that
the
was
Great
like
Train Robbery or something.
That was like 1899 or something to that effect. So they still had movies and they had projectors. So you could still do a lot of propaganda. And I think like that's another important thing that people don't really understand about World War I is that this was when you can really dig into the nationalist idea of your state. Like what it meant to be British, what it meant to be French or German or Austro-Hungarian. Never mind. Not that one. But the other ones, Russian, what it meant to be Russian, those other like big nation states that had a more cultural identity as opposed to like the ones that fell apart, like the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right? You could really dig into that and have people ask themselves, well, I am, what does it mean to be British? Well, that means to give to the war effort. That means to go run into a machine gun because the guy that's telling you to do so hasn't fought a war aside from, subjugating natives in, whatever far off flung land, like for the last 30 years. So,
and part of that national identity being tied up with your leader. I mean, like in the States, yes, you had a president that's elected, but, largely the world was still ruled by emperors and kings and whatnot. And so, and that was even like, Britain, their monarchy, although severely weakened compared to what it once was not quite the figurehead that it is today. And then obviously the Ottoman Empire, and Emperor, Austrian-Hungary, the German Empire. You had the
Kaiser.
Czars. Yeah,
for
exactly.
the Kaiser,
the Kaisers are
still,
around. The Czars
for
still
Nicholas,
around. Yeah. So you could tie up that.
Yeah, as depicted in the film, they have generals who are sitting up in a mansion having food catered to them, and they are sending men out into battle who have not had solid rations and telling them up until, not to spoil, but I'm sure this is something that's known, that still had them going and fighting up until the 11 o'clock ceasefire.
Yep.
And sending them back out into
with
the field.
Russia, like, go out in there, you don't have a gun yet, just wait for somebody else to die and pick up their gun. Yeah. And it's like, what horrific advice that would be. Can you imagine being part? First of all, I would never be part of an army anyways. I'm far too chicken shit, and I don't believe in any sort of like, outside of World War II, I don't think there's been a war that I would feel like was a noble
or justified,
cause.
right?
Justified. But I couldn't imagine, joining an army and being like, okay, let's, give it for king and country. And then, I don't have a weapon for you, but somebody out there is going to die. When you see him fall, just pick that one up and be like, okay, boss.
Let's go.
Like to Michael's point, talking about nationalism, like a large portion of these empirical sort of wars are you going out subjugating other people who don't have the means to actually fight a realistic resistance. And then you have naval warfare, which is completely disparate from, any of the folks who are living in the homeland. You don't see these things. It's not on your soil. It's just something happening in the far off. So yes, Spain, there's a French armada and the Spaniards are firing cannonballs at each other, but that's not really rocking you where you live. So now when you're talking about just digging up large areas of France and establishing these, trenches for everybody to just start hurling poisonous gas at one another, and think of the fallout of the surrounding areas and people running in and laying siege to local farms and things like, it's fascinating to see the reverberations of this, where it actually does start to affect people living in that country. And you do have to have a sense of national pride at that point to be like, hey, they are completely sullying our homes, destroying the area where we live, and we have to fight back, or else you see what the fallout is. There are actual repercussions to this, as opposed to, somebody else's home somewhere got torn up because we decided to invade them. It's a little bit different. So really interesting melange of circumstances in the world at that time to cause that war.
And impacts from the war. I mean, something we haven't touched on in this conversation, but the very country in which we live in didn't really become the major world economic superpower that it is today until after World War I, just because of because we got to stay out of it largely, and all the great powers in the world were just devastated as a result. Right, Britain goes into this the world superpower. And then leaves a shadow of its former self, still able to, be a great power. But then by the end of World War II, that's,
gone,
it for them.
tired.
Too.
And we're reaping the whirlwind, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, same thing like with, the rest. Germany gets crippled. Russia gets crippled. Britain walks away, but a shadow of its former self. Whereas the States gets to emerge like unscathed and a world superpower. And from there, we took it and ran, even though not everybody agreed with it.
And a lot of inventive minds at the start of the Industrial Revolution, as we know, with, packaged foods that we were sending off and things like that. Yeah, there's a lot of really fascinating.
In the advent of what would become the United Nations.
Yeah.
With the League of Nations, starting to form there.
As a necessity, because, Canada was not invading us at the time. So.
not prepared for that.
But your southern border was still open and people just flooding in.
You know, I do love that that is something, and I think we've talked about that on this show, that like we've omitted from the histories in the United States that, you know, the Canadians came and ransacked the White House and were able to do so and then just peaceably walk back out and say, like, by the way, we're not going to rape, pillage, or set fire to anything else on our way out. We're just making a statement. Stay in your lane, behave a little bit, and just comport yourselves with a little more dignity. Really fascinating. It's just never taught. I have never heard that discussed in the course of the American educational system.
Because that's not American exceptionalism. We tried to invade Canada, and Canada's like, whoa, hold on a second. No. You best go sit down. We're going to show you a little bit of something.
And there's still some very angry Frenchmen with their fingers on the button who are more than willing to send us some funds. So we can manage this for a little while. But so anyway, I figured we could lean into the fact that, you know, we've got some folks that are very pleased and tickled by history on this podcast. and get a little bit of content out of it. So there you go. But I would heartily recommend you both watch that movie. It's well worth the expended time, and it's a fascinating film, heartrending, and probably, I would hope, holds up the legacy of the prior filmic iterations or the book itself.
See, that's why I like this podcast, because on this podcast, we can talk about everything, everywhere, all at once.
I thought you were going to make some joke about the imperial reverberations of, you know, all of this enmity, the rage, the chaos, and yet now we've reached a state where a Canadian boy and an Australian woman can have passionate love, all based on a love of bones.
Yep.
See, you're circling back to pre-roll conversations. I was trying to spin off your all, you know, Quiet on the Western Front, Oscar talk, and since we were kind of wrapping up the World War talk, I was trying to spring in another movie so we can pitch off that and go elsewhere.
And I took you out back.
And that's right. You can have my bloomin' onion.
I have not seen everything everywhere all at once, or whatever the hell that, you know.
I think you got the title right, yeah.
It's quite good. It's quite good.
I heard it has been greatly aggrandized to me by a number of my colleagues, so I will have to investigate.
Yeah, I have to see All Quiet on the Western Front. I also still need to see Top Gun Maverick. Ironically, I had never seen the original Top Gun.
Same.
And then when Top Gun Maverick came out and it was all the rage, I was like, okay, I got to check this out. So I went and watched the original Top Gun in preparation to watch Maverick. Really enjoyed Top Gun. Thought it was a great film. Very much enjoyed it, and then just never got around to Maverick.
Okay, it's campy. It's one of again, like, you don't hear a lot about Tony Scott just being the quote unquote the lesser of the Scott brothers. He did an excellent job with that film. It is campy in all the right ways. It's entertaining. It's action oriented. I found Maverick very entertaining as well. It has that same sort of feel that Return of the first Star Wars episode 8.
Oh no, that's The Last Jedi.
The JJ, was it?
Yeah. The Return of Skywalker, I think, was the ninth one. Yeah.
So
Last Jedi. Yeah.
It has that same sort of feel of like we're paying homage to a lot of the things that had happened in the prior film, and we kind of have echo sequences throughout that. Force Awakens is what I was thinking of. Sorry.
Oh, from number 7. Okay.
Yes. Sorry, my brain. Welcome to the club, kids.
My brain.
My brains. My eyes. What am I, Zach Bagans? So, yeah, those were the other things I watched today. Harkening back to another topic that had been on the show previously. I wanted to see how angry I could get Michael. I anticipated this being a duet as opposed to, our trio here.
I mean,
but
sorry to crash the party.
No, you're fine. So I was watching a really horrible Amazon documentary about a haunting that was investigated by police in a general area, and that spilled over into the Zach Bagans documentary that he did on the Demon House of Gary, Indiana. And I know we had lengthy discussions about spiritual energy and how much it peeves our friendly neighborhood physicist here. So I had a chuckle at just watching folks badly attempt to stage spectral activity. The documentary I watched, it's like the haunting of Gary Avenue or some random nonsense here. It's like there's 12 of them.
Gary, Indiana.
It's so
Gary
stupid. The Demon House one was at least entertaining because Zach Bagans knows enough to be hyperbolic to a fault. But this other crew is like, they're all just deadpan. the least charismatic people you'd ever want to see trying to report on all these things. And they did the hokiest, most ridiculous sort of like ghost scares that you can have in a paranormal investigation of the in the kitchen as they're talking about how a knife, when someone was using a Ouija board, which they called a witch board.
It's like, that's
no
how you
one's
pronounce
ever.
it.
It's like no one has ever called it that. It's like it's also known as a witch board. It's like no, it's called a talking board or a demon board. I've never heard anybody call it a witch board. But they're trying to make it's a witch lady across the street who had cursed this house. So it's a witch board. That's right. So they're talking about a steak knife that flew up out of the knife block and flew across the room. And as they're saying that, there's a giant grate that falls out of the wall across the room behind them. So of course they have the big noise that they get to pan to.
What was that?
Look at that. And like, oh, the pictures on the wall have been turned upside down. And I'm like, you haven't even gone the lengths that people do on television programming to say, we have all of our crew outside of the house reporting where their locations are, to say that it's not them very obviously pulling on a string to help dislodge these things and make them fall down, or make up these manufactured, like, oh, we saw a ghost apparition crawl into the window, and then it's someone very obviously just walks in front of the window and goes, and then walks away. And they have all these cameras set up, and they're all blurry and out of focus, and so you can't make sense of anything happening. It's like, these are HD cameras. This is 2023, friend. If you can't get a fucking straight image of these things as they're happening, like, you're doing something wrong.
That's why I want to see Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster.
Uh-huh.
Let's see some quality footage of these guys.
Let me enhance it. Enhance that shit.
Oh, fuck, like, yeah, they could do that in Blade Runner, but you can't manage it in 2023. It's like, yeah, in 1972, when someone's running around with a handheld camera, I get grainy footage, but yeah not these days.
No.
So it gave me a nice chuckle where I was like, I'm sure that Michael, our friendly neighborhood physicist, is just going to be irate that anyone is still having discussions about, there's residual energy in the house. It's a haunting.
But that's why the cameras were, out of focus, because the residual energy messed with the electronics within the camera, and that's why the lens apparently didn't work. So you can have some very terribly edited, ghost just like, wah!
In the Demon House documentary as well, they did have a section where they were claiming that Zach Bagans was giving off more physical energy output, like he actually was exuding a joule's worth of energy, causing one of these devices they have to read in the red, because he had absorbed this spiritual energy and was radiating from his person. It's like a human being makes like 1/1,000,000th of this amount of power, and he's just reading this energy. It's like, oh my god,
he's about to go Super Saiyan.
I mean, he is pretty attractive. He could give off a joule of physical energy.
The sad thing is that it also, as he's doing this, he's miming that he's been possessed by this goat demon, right? And so he's like, and then here's the moment where, and of course you've heard Zach Bagans before, so he's just like this dead, toneless, inflectionless. At this moment, I thought that I was going to attack Jerry. And you watch him, and he's literally in camera going, and then backs off. He's like, and I stopped myself because I knew I might hurt him. And I'm like, oh my god, if you're possessed by an entity, you are not having rational thought of like, I might creepily, sneak up behind this gentleman and strangle the life out of him like I'm a Nosferatu villain, just doing the creepy Sims stance to walk up behind him. Like, oh my god, these things hurt my brain, but I can't stop watching them.
Beautiful.
It's like candy.
Have either of you seen either of the Ghost series, the BBC one or the Paramount Plus?
I have not watched it yet, but it looks intriguing.
Yeah, they're quite funny. I started with the Paramount Plus, the American version, and then checked out the BBC one. In truth, I would just pick one or the other and then skip to the next season, because like the American one is practically shot for shot. Like having watched the American one, I was like, oh, this is really funny. Like, I'd love to go check out the BBC one. And then it was like, oh, it's all the same jokes. Like, it was literally the exact same thing. I was like, oh, I'm not actually.
They just lifted it.
Yeah, and I was like, okay, it was funny the first time. And I know that I'm watching the original version, so this should be the one I'm like, yeah. But now I'm like, I'm over it because I've already seen it. So I knew the next beat coming. So I was like, okay, they didn't change it in any way. They might for season 2. I didn't bother to invest deeper into that. But at any rate, it's definitely worth checking out one or the other because they're both quite good.
I always thought it was weird. The Americans kept talking about tea and crumpets, and it was just very odd.
Have you had a crumpet, by the way? Have we discussed this previously?
Have we talked about what?
Oh, crumpets are delightful.
Crumpets are delicious with a little bit of apricot jam.
Oh, I'm just a straight butter on a crumpet kind of cat myself.
No, I need a little apricot jam or maybe some fig.
Remember, sweet and savory don't mix with me. I finally had a brownie up here that was a bacon brownie, and Courtney's not listening to this, but on the off chance she ever discovers, they had big chunks of bacon on this brownie, and it really threw me off because all of a sudden I just have this fatty piece of bacon at the end where it's like, even when it was crisp, it kind of just jarred me where I liked the flavor. So I will stand corrected in saying that the two should never meet. It was very tasty, but at the same time, as a textural thing for me, I was like, oh, what's happening?
Oh, no.
I turned into Adam West again. Like, oh,
no.
Save me, old chum. There's bacon on this brownie. The Joker must have gotten me with another feisty
I don't know
fiend.
If bacon and brownie. I mean, well, bacon goes on donuts well. I think a brownie's too dense for it.
It was tasty. I wish that they had used something like Bako Bits or something that would have had a little more crunch as opposed to making me rubber chew it.
Yeah, like when you want bacon in something that's like a pastry of that, you want it to just no fat.
Yeah. Yes.
Just pure, yeah. I will say that I used to, when I was in college living in the dorms, you get to make your own. I had a waffle iron that you get to make in the make stuff with. I would always pour bacon into it because I didn't go by the rules. I didn't like using just pure, batter.
Okay.
So I would always have my waffles with bacon in it. So just to drive that home, like I think that it's an okay thing to mix those two. Put a little bit of maple syrup on top, but
a waffle is not inherently sweet. Like a waffle,
that's fair.
Like I could, so if you aren't like a sweet and savory person, adding bacon to your waffle doesn't necessarily make it a sweet dish. Now, if you go and put on the maple syrup or like whipped cream and all that jazz, then yes, you've gone into that territory. But you could just do the waffle, bacon, some eggs on it or something like that. And it could be more of a savory dish than anything.
And, people love throwing waffles and chicken together. So obviously there's a precedent here. And this man made crepes for a living, so he should know.
Listen, a spinach and feta crepe with some chicken.
Yeah. I don't disagree.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. Like waffles in that same vein are kind of like a more neutral...
True.
There is sugar in the batter, though. It's not quite pancake level, but they are getting a little sweet. Yeah, but I mean,
by that
them,
logic, there's sugar in bread as well, but nobody.
Yeah,
argues
and biscuits.
Yeah, but nobody argues that those are savory items.
Breaded chicken is an abomination.
But Michael, I will say, if you have not had the opportunity to have, float over to a Trader Joe's, they actually do have crumpets.
Oh.
And it is a world of difference between a crumpet and an English muffin.
Oh, okay.
It is a dramatic textural difference, and you will thank me for it.
Okay.
So since you mentioned Trader Joe's and you name dropped Courtney just a bit ago, I do, on the off chance she listens to this, I just want to express my disappointment that on a recent bit of her own podcast, they had a conversation regarding grocery stores. And HEB did not get mentioned at all. And I think if you're having a conversation about, really like strong grocery stores and HEB doesn't come up into the conversation, you need to reevaluate.
I don't know if they exist in Phoenix.
Oh, it doesn't matter. But everybody knows the Heb. They're nationally ranked number one.
Everybody knows the Heb.
Nationally ranked number one. They don't exist in Florida, and yet they sent out trucks down there for the hurricanes to help out and stuff. Like HEB,
people swarmed them.
Yeah, I miss HEB. No longer having one down the road. It's heartbreaking.
I've found, that I can find pretty much the same thing almost everywhere. So I'm just looking for the cleanliness of the store. But since we're here and we're doing that plug, if you haven't listened, go check out Love Food, Hate Money. It's great podcasts. It's very well done. They're very entertaining and engaging folks. And that if you've missed Courtney, you can find her there. She's off doing better things with more entertaining people. But yeah,
I don't know about better things. I mean, we just talked about HEB. I didn't hear HEB on her, so
rough.
Just
Easy.
kidding, Courtney. Love you.
Damn. Ooh.
I'm the one that brought it up. Clearly, I listen. Clearly, I'm a fan.
There's a place up here called New Seasons, which I am very thrilled by. It is it's a classed up version of Sprouts for me here. Very well
what
done.
seasons are they exemplifying? Are they catering towards because it's not just normal old seasons?
Correct. It's Pluflunger. That is,
Okay.
It's the space that's kind of between, fall and winter. There's a kind of a brief breath before you start going into the plunge and getting the snowfall.
Okay, I see that. All right.
So,
all right.
yeah, the Pluflunger, they have some really wonderful breakfast treats that they serve during
Ooh,
that.
okay.
A Farferkegel is probably one of the best ones.
think
It
I
involves
heard
an
that one.
Australian archaeologist and
Yeah.
some meat.
Mhm.
And, you wrap it
Oh,
up into
dear.
a tight bun, and it's just savory and sweet all at once. And I don't normally go for that,
And it's
as I've mentioned.
aged to
Fine
perfection.
and seasoned. Let's note, very well
That's
seasoned.
right. My Cub Scout is pitching a tent in my Speedos.
Fucking
during
hell!
this.
If I
Stop
hear
saying
no
Cub
more,
Scout, please.
I don't want any.
It was a lyric. It was a callback.
I'm
know.
also going to throw out that we have not said the word up, and I have to qualify it to say the joke, but we haven't said the word cherry once on this show thus far, and I have never been so happy.
Although now we do have to quickly tie in and just say, for those tuning in with eager anticipation for the final
I.e.
part,
you.
the return of the Cherry Poppin' Daddies. Hey, I know it. There's at least one other person out there because they commented on the YouTube.
True, they did.
Well, they
posting,
commented
so-
on the first episode, not the subsequent 7. So we'll see whether or not they stuck around. But
Cherry Poppin' Daddies will be coming back. It's just
pun intended.
as obvious by last week's kind of missing episode, and then
Today.
some of the kind of the format, and then today being a bit of a different time from our normal schedule. It is kind of freewheeling here, but we'll get back on track for the final conclusion of the Cherry Poppin' Daddies, or we won't, and we'll just leave everybody hanging.
I'm perfectly fine with leaving it hanging.
We haven't done. It's not like we haven't done that before.
You make a fine point. Where's the L. Ron Hubbard Part 2 that I've been waiting for
I
for
do
all
have
this
that
time?
written. I don't want to present it.
I don't blame you.
Could also just never have Doc back here, and then it also wouldn't be the first time you've had host just suddenly disappear.
You make a fine
Oh
point.
God,
Yeah.
you're right too. Oh fuck.
Some people just drop off the face of the earth without a word spoken.
Oh,
That's
jeez.
right. One episode they're here, and the next, what happened?
Well, as the
Still
Lord
a
High
mystery.
Charlie of ghosting, I can't say that I blame him. But well, I believe that is going to wrap things up for us here this evening on another soul-stirring ghost adventure, if you will. Zach Bagans, please do not sue. But for the Lord of Ghosting and the Lords of All Media, wait, there's another trademark I'm infringing upon. For those of us here at the Disinformed Podcast, we thank you for being here as always. If you have enjoyed the show, there are ways you can convey that to us. Of course, we would love it if you would like, subscribe, rate, and review. We would love to hear from you. And whenever you engage, Michael gets his wings. It's a delightful time for all involved
Oh,
parties.
jeez.
There's a link in the show notes below that is going to take you to all of our irrelevant socials if you're looking to find us there, and we'll also help you to subscribe because we got new episodes winging your way every lovely Monday morning. And we will also have an After Dark this week where we explore the joys of the teaser trailer for All Quiet on the Western Front, so you can go and observe that there on the Tubes of You, which we're very fond of and we love immensely. So go check us out over there. But I think that is going to draw things to their final conclusion, if you will. And so for the Disinformed Podcast this week, I'm Shane.
And I'm Michael.
Fuck.
And zippity zoop, we're out of here.